Welcome to our channel, where we set out to explore wonderful, great works of literature.
While dressed in elegant clothing, because
Why the hell not? So today we have a little bit of a surprise for our viewers, particularly people who might be interested in vintage. I wouldn't even say vintage, like antiquarian style books, like very old, limited editions, if you will. And this we picked up in Edinburgh, in a bookshop, in an old bookshop, and it was quite beautiful. It was right by the Grass Market. That's where it was. It was in the Grass Market. And it just really popped out at me. It's called The Necromancer, or The Tale of the Black Forest. And it's a gothic novel. And the way in which we figured out its existence is through Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, which we had reviewed not too long ago. And I think she describes 7 horrid novels, they call it. And so if you recall from our review, the main heroine of that story was obsessed with reading supernatural fiction and gothic horror. And one of the ones that I think is referenced is The Necromancer. An interesting point is that many people who had read Northanger Abbey, a lot of scholars actually assume that she had just made up that title and that the book doesn't actually exist.
But it does. It was just in German.
Yeah, so apparently in the tradition, I guess, is that a lot of British publishers, English publishers especially, I think that to sell a lot of their books, especially the gothic supernatural variety, they always kind of like had it that it was translated originally from the German, and these are like old German gothic tales. Mm-hmm. And there was like this sense of sort of like allure about them, and people would be like, oh, it's so forbidden, oh, like, you know, it comes from, you know, this other nation that has superstitious views and whatnot. And so it was very good at selling the products, selling the books themselves. Mm-hmm. But this in fact turned out to be true. It was actually translated in the English into the English from the German,
and apparently not very well translated.
Not very well translated. The actual author, it says it's authored by Ludwig Flammenberg, but that was a pseudonym for a gentleman by the name of Carl Friedrich Kahlert, and it was first published in 1794. So this is quite one of the early sort of gothic novels, and yeah, it was an interesting. I guess that's what I would describe it. An interesting reading it. Because it wasn't particularly scary. Like, they had some moments of intrigue.
Yeah, I think the ending was the highlight of it.
So yeah. That's a good point. So what we felt, and actually we read quite a number of reviews that kind of echoed our sentiments about it, is that it's a narrative within a narrative within a narrative. And it gets kind of convoluted. And sometimes it feels like the language gets very archaic, and other times it's quite easy to read. But it's almost like sometimes it feels like a slog. Like it just words upon words upon words that are just not helping propel the plot very well. And with a lot of the main characters who there aren't really necessarily main characters per se, but the first people who are actually explaining the story or telling the story, they don't have many, they don't have much character. They don't have many attributes to them. They're not particularly vivid sort of narrators in any way. You don't really feel for them. But the last 3 characters, one is the Necromancer, the Volkert, the other one is a man named Wolf, and the other one is John the Servant. Those ones end up being the most vividly portrayed characters. And I felt like it was not only at the last 30 pages of this 200-something page novel where I started to get interested in the story.
Yeah, I would say the last third of the book was interesting.
Yeah, so there's still some thrilling moments in it, like still some things that you'd be kind of unexpected, like even for today's age you'd be like, oh, that was quite chilling. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I felt, it kind of leaves you with a sense of exhaustion when you're reading it, and not necessarily fulfilling in any sense of the word with regard to like the horror or the terror aspect. It didn't really have that much of that pull that you would get from maybe something that we had read earlier, which
it did feel like things were a lot, like, now that we know the translation wasn't the greatest from German to English, it does make it sound like there's just lots lost in translation. Like, the language, it lost the essence of the story at times.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then then they would have moments of that would draw you back in, and then quickly it would let you go again. But the last third was really great.
Yeah.
I almost wish they could have just shortened up the first 3 stories. It was also told in letter form.
Sometimes parts of it were letter.
Yeah.
And parts of it were just like just exposition.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing, it was just so promising, because if you look at this is actually, I think,
beautiful.
This is an edition from 1927, and you can see it's beautifully designed.
Show the advertisement.
Yeah, and there's an actual advertisement for Pear's soap at the back, and you have this like very like 18th century looking lady with a very creepy child in a bath. So yeah, it's a wonderful.
Yeah, I would say the cover is kind of spookier than the book.
Yeah, it's true. I think it was more of an aesthetic pleasure just even holding this book and reading it than it was.
When was this one published?
1927. By London Robert Holden and Co. Limited.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I love how it actually says founded on facts. Just like that. Founded on facts. That's everything recorded here is purely factual. But one thing I found kind of interesting was kind of seeing detecting the philosophical or sort of the zeitgeist of the time, and this would probably be around the Enlightenment period. And everything is all about sort of, you have this dichotomy of this supernaturalism and irrationalism and mysticism and necromancy and all this sorcery stuff. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, it's almost like someone commented like it's like a Scooby-Doo thing.
Yeah, it did feel Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
Scooby-Doo.
Where at the end everything is exposed as like trickery, deception, just charlatanism, and everything just has a rational underpinning that explains away.
Like a very like non-romantic lesson.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I felt at the end was.
Yeah.
Because even in horror, there's sometimes like some sort of a sense of romance to it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, one thing I should mention is one of those the last sort of exposition is by a gentleman. Well, I would hardly call him a gentleman. He's more like a vagabond, named Wolf.
Oh yeah.
And he was sort of murderer, a thief, and really kind of fate deals him a heavy blow. Mm-hmm. And apparently that was actually taken from, almost like plagiarized from a work by Schiller, by Friedrich Schiller, who was a famous German writer and poet.
That's too bad, because it was like one of the best parts of it. It was
the
Wolf character.
Yeah, very interesting.
In the end, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it took a very sort of like humanistic stance with regard to Wolf's sort of exposition. But yeah, it was very interesting. That aspect of that part was interesting, but that was of course near the end, and then you're done. Yeah. So should we move on to the other one?
Yeah. Well, and I would say I read this between reading this one with Shant, and you can't even really compare the genre.
Do you want to give like a background of what it is about?
So this is about starts out with this physician or scientist, and he wants to study paranormal, but it's kind of ridiculed within his I don't know, discipline, I guess.
It's like psychical research.
Yeah, he wants to do, but he wants to study the paranormal.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
And so he sends off all these letters to a bunch of people who have been at some point had recorded through news or some sort of history that they've had some sort of psychological experience through. Sorry, not psychological experience, but had some sort of paranormal experience. Like, what is that thing called when they throw ghosts?
Oh, poltergeist.
Yeah, so one of the ladies, Eleanor, had a history of a poltergeist kind of following her and throwing stones at her.
And she's the main character, Eleanor.
Yeah, Eleanor's the main character.
Yeah.
It turns out. And then there's Theodora, who's this kind of like bohemian lady who has issues at home, but she claims to have like some sort of psychic ability, but that's kind of questionable because she's kind of more like beautiful and bohemian, and maybe has like a female love interest, and they're fighting, and so she wants to kind of get away from that domestic issue happening. And then the third guy, I think it was, why do I want to call him Luke? I don't think it was Luke. Anyway, there's the third gentleman was actually going to be the owner of, would be the inheritor of
the estate.
The estate.
Yeah.
The Hill House.
Yeah.
And so I think his family is just kind of like wants him to get out of their hair for a little bit and go look at the estate. And so he's the third one. Out of all the letters he sent, I think he sent about 10 letters or something like that. The doctor and only Eleanor and Theodora are the only ones who consented, and Luke was kind of sent along.
So it's originally now there's 4 occupants of this household, and then there's 2 other people there who they're the servants.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the servants don't go anywhere near this house because they're convinced it's haunted, right?
No, they go into the house. They go into the house, just not at dark.
Just not at dark. Yeah, well,
yeah.
I guess what I mean.
Yeah, and they're very like weird. They're just very kind of grumpy and standoffish.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is Luke. Oh, good. I don't have too terrible memory.
Good memory. Good memory. Yeah.
Anyway, so they're all basically all get to this house, and these events happen, and
paranormal events.
At first, nothing happens, and then the doctor tells the history of the house, and why he was so interested in it, and then slowly things start to happen. But it's very interesting because from the beginning, it is rather disjointed, like because it's told by the doctor, and then it quickly shifts to being mostly Eleanor's perspective, and it kind of fades in and out, and it's not until she is a little, even from her drive in, you start to get this idea that she is in her head a lot. Like she's like, oh, and it kind of a very vivid imagination. So like as she's driving into the hill, she's like, oh, imagine if it's this people outside, what are they doing? She makes up this whole elaborate story about them, and so she has a very vivid imagination. And then when she gets there, it seems like whatever supernatural thing is there is kind of targeting her. And the house itself is very interesting. So what's interesting is Shirley Jackson actually based the house off of just a random, I think it was newspaper article or something that she saw, or catalog or something with the house from California.
No, I think she talked to her mother about it, and there was it was like a relation, an old great grandfather who was an architect of this old this old Californian house that was quite haunted looking, and then she developed a plan, and she was quite elaborate in terms of the structure of it. Yeah,
so it actually made me kind of think of the opera house in The Phantom of the Opera, how it's all these like things are on weird angles purposely so the doors can never stay open, they always shut, and it gives you this weird vertigo. So when you look out the window, everything's all slanted, but when you're inside, all the proportion, all the architecture had been designed so it makes you think that you're walking straight and everything's in perspective, but actually it's very all off. Very disorienting. So the house itself is like clearly designed to mess with your mind, which is interesting. And so you wonder throughout, is it like clearly there is something supernatural happening, but you wonder too, I wondered if it was going to be in the ending that it was all in Eleanor's head, and it was just because there's this kind of alluding that she was already a little bit off before she came there. I got the impression that she was like kind of like she had a lot of resentment towards her mother, who she took care of, and then she never seemed to give herself permission to leave every situation she was ever in. So like she took sounded like she took full care of her mother, and then her mother died and didn't treat her very well, and then she moved in with her sister, and the sister's sort of her brother-in-law, and they didn't treat her very nicely. But like didn't seem like she ever tried to make this was like her first attempt to get to like do something for herself. Independence. So she had this like elation, and then she realized when she got there that like she didn't want to leave, because even with all this stuff happening, it was the most exciting thing that's ever happened to her. So she was like almost an easy target.
And so it maintains an ambivalence as to, up until the very last page, there's an ambivalence as to whether this is all just in her head or these are actually supernatural or paranormal events happening. It's very
chilling, and it's very, the way she writes is kind of it puts you disoriented. You're like, wait, what day is it? Like sometimes it's almost, it cuts out as if a whole day passed and it's just nighttime again, without explanation as to why. And so as it goes further, it shows that she's losing concept of time, and she's losing you wonder, everyone's like laughing and you're wondering, is this all in her head? There's situations where she's like spying and being like kind of creepy in the background, and starts to talk as if she is the ghost or the ghost is her. And so you're wondering, is she now possessed? Was she always possessed? Did she always have like some sort of mental health issue, or what was going on? Was she just like, was it just a bad combination where she finally felt like she was attached to something and then everyone rejected her, and so she took that to heart? Like, never really know, but it was definitely creepy and definitely a page turner. It was awesome.
So that's great, and it sounds like what Shirley Jackson does is that what makes her
kind of a cool cover too.
What makes her book or her story so thrilling is that she doesn't give anything away. She lets the reader decide what's happening, or she leaves it rather indeterminate, so that she doesn't explain things away, as opposed to the Necromancer, where everything is unraveled in the end. It's all shown to be, a farce or a fakery, and it kind of like, it leaves you with a sense of feeling a little bit cheated, right?
Yeah, and it moves too quickly from scene to scene in the Necromancer. It's like, next. Yeah, it's
a series of events.
And you're like, where am I now? Who's talking? Whereas with this, it's like all based around the house, and so you really get to intimately know the characters.
Yeah, more character development. Yeah. But also nothing's given away. But
also, weirdly enough, you also don't get to know the characters. Like, you only really kind of get to know Eleanor. The other characters, they don't even really like describe them that well. It's very interesting. There's just kind of like, that Theodora is very, from Eleanor's perspective, very beautiful, but you don't hear from anyone else's perspective. Is she actually beautiful, or is this all in Eleanor's head?
Yeah.
And like you get a pretty good description of the doctor and the doctor's wife, but you don't really ever get a good description of Luke.
Yeah, it's through her eyes.
Yeah.
It seems like you're viewing things through her eyes.
Yeah, exactly, which is like, she was obviously had some sort of deep bond with Theodora, and like was really quite drawn to her out of everyone in the house. So of course, just like in real life, you'd focus more on people you're interested in getting to know. And like, maybe she was somewhat, who knows, maybe she was somewhat, you get the hint that it's like kind of like a sisterly love, but there was a deep, like almost almost an issue, like an attachment, where Theodora at points was like, okay, she's getting a bit weird with me.
Oh, right.
Yeah. But then quickly, like, also comes back and finds. Anyway, it was very good, very very good.
Yeah. Did you want to just say anything else? Discuss anything else about either of these two books?
Just drastically different. Like, I actually don't. This is why I don't tend not to read Gothic novels. It's your kind of classic Gothic tale, and to me, it doesn't really do it for me. And but
so you, just you I've read a number of sort of. I've read a lot of Gothic tales, and I must admit, like, this one gets rather tiresome very quickly. It's a little bit difficult to get through, but things like Matthew Lewis's The Monk, or The Italian by Anne Radcliffe, those are all phenomenal, and those are like really exciting. This one kind of didn't make the cut in that respect, but
but this one's awesome. Like, I don't usually like Gothic. I don't usually like horror. And I was like, this is the first horror I've ever really liked. And then Sean was like, did you ever really read any other horror?
Yeah, it's like the only horror that you ever read.
No, I think I've attempted ones like this, and this is always the outcome. It's either like way too gory for me that I'm like, this isn't interesting, or kind of, that's been my experience. But this one was more psychological, and I like that. So
should we rate this one first then?
Sure.
Okay.
Me or you?
You.
Okay. I will give it a 3.
Yeah, I would give it a 3.1. Just probably because the cover.
You just want to beat me.
Because it's because the cover's
we're not rating
awesome.
The cover. The cover would be like, this is so cool. The cover would be like, definitely a 5.
I'd still give it.
Look at how creepy that is. That's way creepier than the book.
Yeah, I'd give it a 3.1.
At least the English translation.
Yeah.
Like, look at that baby. It's so creepy.
Yeah, it's a great cover.
Okay, from your memory, what would you give this one?
I would give it a solid 3.7.
Oh really? I would give this like a 4.5. I thought it was
really?
I thought it was so well done.
Yeah.
And then the more I sat back and just thought about it, the more interesting it got.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting, because it's like there's always this question of, and this is something I kind of want to briefly touch on. It's just like, we could talk about this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
there's this idea, oh, is it a supernatural event? Is it a haunting? Or is it just her psychologically kind of like, disturbed or whatever?
Right.
But like...
Whereas this, it kind of ruined the supernatural. It was like, nothing supernatural,
right.
really.
But like, in this sense, it's like, there need not be that distinction. Like, whatever is psychological, in a sense, can present weird phenomena that is inexplicable. For example, like, people's unconscious attitudes towards like an object can actually make the object react in a way to the person. For example, like someone's on a computer, right? And they just hate technology, they hate computers, and they're like always frustrated because it never seems to work for them. But have you found that like most people who have these things, that it always affects these people who are so anxious or angry around these particular computers. And so there is a sense in which there's an interaction between the object and the environment and the person who comes into it with their own, with their own psychological makeup, their own complexes, or all of these different things. So maybe she was animating all of these bizarre things. It could have been like, it need not have been just purely psychological, it's just simply in her head, but she could actually be manifesting through her own disturbances in the outside through her interactions with them, right?
Yeah, well, the way I kind of think about it was like, she wanted to possess the house, meaning that she wanted to like it to be her home. She wanted it to be literally her home.
That's
like,
interesting.
She never belonged anywhere. She always says that. Like, she never belonged anywhere. She never really had any friends. She never really left anywhere. So she wanted this to be her home, and she had put so much hope into this and her journey, right? Her like desperate ploy to leave everything behind her. And so then in a way the house possessed her, and it became a possession of each other. But
in a sense, I like how you said it earlier, where you're like, in a way she was the haunting of the house.
Oh yeah.
So that's quite
but there were phenomenon things happening to everyone in the house. Right. But before she was clearly possessed.
Yeah, because it had a history of murders and all these weird things happening in the house, right?
Not murders. The wife would always... The man would remarry, his wife would commit suicide. The man would remarry, the wife would commit suicide, always in the house.
I wonder if that was hinting at something.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Wow. So definitely very, very good. We definitely recommend one over the other, though, for sure.
And just to like kind of go off of that a bit more, like if you think about even people who become obsessed about an achievement, right? And it's like, even thinking about going back to the black tulip, right? We were talking about how he was so obsessed with this tulip that he would commit any crime, that thief.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can become possessed by an idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the creepiest thing, is when you do have control, but you don't have the awareness of what you're doing.
You're unconscious of it, yeah. Well, anyway... Well, thank you for joining us this evening. It was really bizarre. I mean, it's springtime. It's still kind of cold around here. We have sun and cloud and rain, but it's still a little bit chilly. And it seems like a weird time to be doing like two kind of ghost stories.
Yeah, we should be doing it in the fall.
This should be like fall, Halloween.
But it's raining and kind of like cool out for the last week.
Yeah. But there is something, there's something quite spooky about, imagine walking through sort of like a moor, like a Scottish moor in the rain and cold.
And this like figure just passes by and you don't see their face.
That's right, exactly.
But they give you a chill.
It's kind of in this sort of like this feeling that we're kind of trying to evoke right now. So anyway, well, thank you for joining us again. And we hope you join us next time very soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.